Okay, I'm hoping that I'm where I'm supposed to be. Welcome to Evolution Hour. It seemed to have trouble recognizing who I was, and I think I'm on the right spot. Hopefully people who are normally going to be watching me will still be able to watch me, but I'll be finding out later on. Okay, so woof! If I find people popping up in the chat, that will clearly indicate that people are seeing me. The menu is slightly different each time, and I don't know whether or not this is due to a change in the restream format or whether or not I'm in a different spot than what it thinks I am. So I'm confused. Anyway, we are presumably putting something out somewhere. Whether or not that will deal with that, we will find out. Anyway, I'm continuing with our Titans. Isn't that a cute little Tyrannosaur? Isn't the graphics wonderful? And if only the science could be as accurate. At any rate, they're continuing with more pterosaurs, basically Gee Whiz class. Part 2 that we'll be dealing with concerns Tim Clarey stuff and his relationship with trying to ramrod national parks and monuments into the creationist worldview. And this one is kind of an intriguing one because it's got an interesting bunch of material from creationists, but not in a creationist vein, which we'll get to that in a bit. So anyway, Sarfati and Tay do some more Gee Whiz stuff. There's a paper from 2021, Williams et al., which is open access, and it's got no taxonomic data. It's just about the flight characteristics of pterosaurs. So it's not exactly something that, whoops, let me get my little thing around here, trying to edit a bullet with two keyboards. So I suspect that's one of the reasons that they like to put up papers that won't have ticking time bomb material in there. Although, even though this isn't adding into their misrepresentation category, they're still all the way over 50% on misrepresenting the technical sources anyway. Not that they have a huge proportion of technical sources in this. The other paper that they deal with, Wang et al. From 2017, also putting that up on 3D scans of pterosaur egg embryos. That's a kind of another matter, because way at the end of the paper, there's a discussion of how the eggs were formed. And they're really talking about local flooding that comes swooping in and squishes the eggs off, and then they end up preserved. No big slosh cataclysm is required for this bit. And remember also that we brought up all the latest paleontology on pterosaur ancestors. But instead of addressing any of that material, Sarfati and Tay spent a big chunk of a page going on and on about Richard Dawkins's speculations from 2009 in The Greatest Show on Earth. So they love to play around with Dawkins and his crowd. Not seeing anybody in our chat, so either nobody has popped in or I'm in another spot on the internet as opposed to where everybody would be expecting me. I don't know. We'll be finding that out when I try to put the source fields in to find out whether or not I can get access to the bloody thing, which I had some little troubles at the last time. It is intriguing me that the background is a different structure than before, which either suggests that I'm suddenly coming in from a completely different format, or that Restream has altered some of their menus, and that was why I was having a little difficulty getting online. We'll find out. So the part 2 relates to good old Tim Clarey picking on national parks, which is ironic topic now that Trump 2.0 is going off the deep end to gut staff. Anyway, they're always trying to cram national parks into their YEC model. And I'm going to be putting links to 2 from 2023, one on the Sleeping Bear Dunes National Lakeshore, which they try to ram into their single lone ice age. There's only one technical source in that, and It's unfortunately not available open access, so I won't be giving that to you. But it is actually a delightful read on the details because it's talking about shoreline shifts of the Great Lakes over many thousands of years before the supposed claimed flood in 2348, and covering in the various details that they can spot millennia that clearly are running way over. Running 1,000 years over the mark, so it's incompatible with young Earth creationism. The other paper, the other post involves the great unconformity, and that, of course, is pegged to the Big Slosh directly. It gives two technical sources, one from 2007, which again is not available open access, so I won't be able to put that in, but the other one is open access, and that's much more interesting, kind of from the point of view about how creationists paint themselves in the popular media. So this is the Garden of the Gods at Colorado Springs. And again, we will be putting a link up to this. This is open access. It's a perfectly satisfactory Geological Society of America thing from 2010, but it's the authors that are intriguing because all of them, all five of them are creationists. Marcus Ross, William Hosch, Steve Austin, John Whitmore, and Tim Clarey. So he's actually alluding to his own material. They very accurately described the physical layouts of the place, and no indication, of course, there's no young Earth creationist scenarios. There's no references to all of that, which I'm assuming is why the Geological Society had no problem coming this up as a perfectly standard publication. But it would have been fun to kind of see what, if anything, Clarey thought he would need to put in to make it justified for the Big Slosh framework, as opposed to the forensics that they were laying out inside the paper directly. It'd be fun to kind of see whether or not any of that is the case. Meanwhile, I'm knee-deep in working on finger up there. Volume 2 of Rocks Were There, the chapter at the moment on cosmology. I finished up a section on the shrinking sun thing that Kent Hovind plays a big deal about, that used to be a more big deal in the creationist movement back in the 80s or so, but has kind of faded off the scope. But Hovind still blathers on it, even up into his debates. And for those of you who haven't heard about that little puppy, it was the idea that some scientists had measured apparent shrinkage of the sun, which they weren't claiming was an indication that the sun was young. But this was back in like 1979. But creationists jumped the gun and assumed, oh yes, it wasn't a fluctuating star. It was literally the sun would have been bigger. And so if it were hundreds of millions or billions of years old, as the standard model had, then it would be so ginormous that it would cause all sorts of troubles. And therefore, we can know that the sun cannot be as old as that because of the shrinking sun thing. Well, part of it was due to the fact that they were doing some bad measurements. Their instruments weren't up to the task, and they had some little glitches on that. It didn't fit well with any of the observations that were made by other scientists. And within a very short time span, they had moved on, and the very scientists that were involved in this were continuing to measure quite accurately, as it turned out, the tiny little occasional fluctuations. Sometimes some get a little bigger, sometimes a little bit smaller. So it didn't have anything to do with the idea of a shrinking sun. And the fact that Kent Hovind is still pushing that kind of thing in the 21st century is an amazing thing. I had a quote from him from the 1996 video that he did that is so bucolic and folksy and stupid that I had it in the older tip work, and I'll be including it in this newer work because it's really hard to beat for him just jumping off the deep end. And also, I tried to get him to pin him down as to where he was getting his source material from. Then another little section that I just finished up is on the missing neutrino problem, which turns out not to be a problem these days. But that's another kind of short life thing. That was a big deal, and often the two were paired together. So there were creationist works in the 80s and 90s that were arguing that because the sun was supposedly shrinking and because the sun was not generating as many neutrinos, seemingly, as the models were indicating that that was an indication that their models were wrong, and some were even arguing, some creationists were arguing that the sun wasn't powered by fusion and all sorts of things. Well, the major resolution to it, first of all, that they built better detectors. Neutrinos aren't easy to detect, so they were getting some of the shortfall just from that route. But the other end of it had to do with the fact that neutrinos have a little tiny mass, and they can flip from one, air quotes, flavor to another. And the ones that were of a different flavor were very hard to detect. And so that they were never missing in the first place. All it was the difficulty of being able to detect them with the instruments that we have available. So there we have that on that front. And I'll be plowing through all my cosmological material. There's a whole ton of stuff to deal with in terms of cataloging some of the oldest galaxies and star formation, and the evidence from the new James Webb Telescope and other astronomy sources that the modern creationist community, which is a surprisingly small bunch of, like 3 or 4 people that basically post on either ICR, CMI, or AIG, or do sidebar stuff in the Creation Research Society quarterly. It's not a big club, and they kind of tiptoe around and cherry pick the little swipes they do at the incoming science information, and they'll be sorting all of that material out. Then not only on the big scale of the formations of galaxies and black holes and quasars in the early part of the universe, but also way down the line about the formation of solar systems, how stars start up and form planetary systems, bits about how cometary systems are formed, and all that stuff. And again, there's a huge body of information that's getting ever more sophisticated, ever more detailed, and the creationists are being really cagey about how they flit into looking at stuff. There's really an interesting divide then between the creationist apologetics in the 80s and 90s era and contemporary stuff that you find on Answers in Genesis and CMI. It's not a coincidence that these organizations have to backpedal on some of these older claims. So the shrinking sun and the neutrino problem and all of that, there are actual posts on their websites where they say, well, this really isn't true anymore, and you really shouldn't use this argument. You don't tend to find that on a lot of other areas. You still find them repeating pretty much the same tropes regarding human evolution and paleontological information, and stuff about the Grand Canyon being formed in a flood. They don't backpedal on that at all. But there is an awful lot of flip-floppery going on in the cosmological era. And this was borne out, frankly, right off the bat from noticing how Answers in Genesis has been basically flushing and recycling their material, so that the material that they would have been presenting 20 years ago is not being the stuff that they're presenting in their more recent editions of their books. So Jason Lisle, when he comes along and does a chapter for the 2007 era, it's completely different. It has no connection with what was in the 2000 era stuff. So Russell Humphreys' cosmology is out the window, and they are now moving the goalposts. And I think there's probably no area in young Earth creationism that has been busier in the goalpost moving department than the cosmological stuff. And it's fun to compare the different camps as to what you get from CMI and AIG, how much of the stuff that Henry Morris was dithering on, because he was not a cosmologist, for one thing. And for that matter, even Duane Gish, who kind of shied away from a lot of this stuff, compared to the apologetics, where you're basically channeling Jason Lisle and Hartnett and a small number of hangers-on that flit around that area. And because the technical literature is remarkably open access here. This is a different context than a lot of the other stuff where, frankly, an awful lot of the geological papers aren't as open access as I would like to see. But the cosmological stuff, you find the monthly notices of the Royal Astronomical Society and the various astrophysics journals. Often that stuff is open access within a year. And so all easy peasy to find out what the original material is. And it's sufficiently abstruse area where a lot of technical formulas and physical science goes on in there that it's way above my pay grade. But I can still approach it from a solid scholarly angle, where I can look at what the arguments are, how well they are received by other people in the field, We'll be noting various controversies as back and forth on issues like on the faint early sun and the extent to which climatological models and carbon dioxide levels and that resolve it or not. There's still some open questions on those things, and in other areas where there ain't. And you've got over in the little sidebar, probably the most disingenuous brand of young Earth creationism has to do with how they will try to disarm the Big Bang by quoting Big Bang critics like Eric Lerner and Halton Arp when their cosmology isn't compatible with young Earth creationism either. So it's a kind of a bait and switch kind of an argument that goes on. And so we'll be putting all that material in. I'm also going to be having a nice little chart in the thing, which is a breakdown of big chronology that will be covering kind of all the sidebar information that I've never really seen stuck in one place. Probably the hardest pieces of information to get are like how big the universe was at the various stages of our history. You get quite a lot of people mentioning how small the universe was in the early stages, a few seconds or minutes, but not really exactly how the expansion goes on from there. And then other about how much can be measured by Planck time. One of the things that I'm trying to reflect in this chart structure is the spectrum of how an awful lot happens really, really fast. And then it slows down in terms of how many Planck time ticks there are. And so it looks like it's kind of like an asymptotic curve that drops off remarkably fast. So when you've got a thing like the universe expanding out to the size of our solar system, literally within a fraction of a second, and that it takes a few minutes to get out to 600 light years, and then hundreds of thousands of years to get out to millions of light years, and then yet more hundreds of millions of years before it got out to 300 million, and then by a few billion years ago, it's about half of its present size. So the scaling of things, even independent of how much inflation is occurring early in the universe and other kinds of things, it means that there's kind of a slowing down of the structure. And once you get past a few billion years, the universe has gotten to be more normal in terms of how planetary systems form and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, we're going into all of that. So I do not see anybody in our chat room. I have no idea whether this is going to end up in the spot where I'm hoping it's going to end up. I'm assuming when I'm done, it will be somewhere. Let me put my little pals up here, our various patrons, who are the ones without which I would not be able to be as monumentally incompetent as I apparently seem to be on this field. All of our colleagues and researchers and assistant researchers and friends, etc. Can't do it without you kids. We muddle along as best we can. And then I will put my little blip up for advert for the Rocks book. Come along. There we go. And let me get you up to speed. Yeah, so I hope that this will end up on my regular channel, and I'll be finding out whether or not I've got some screwball things as to whether or not it thinks I'm one person and the other videos were done by the other. I don't know. We'll find that out during the week. But this will presumably be somewhere, and I'll find out whether or not it's flipped the wrong element. I've only got a couple screen name things going, one with one email structure and the other one, another biggest one. My YouTubes were set up originally. They were done with a completely different email than one I typically use just for a personal email, and that is part of the problem, I think, if we've gone on here. But anyway, cross fingers. We're broadcasting, and we'll see what happens where it goes. We will adapt one way or the other. I can warn you, there's going to be an awful lot of wonderful new information in our second volume. For those of you who enjoyed the first volume, it's going to be zingy pingy on the next one. So anyway, this is a kind of truncated show. It's only 20 minutes. but I don't know whether or not this is landing where it's supposed to. Again, we will find out tomorrow. So everybody watch out for the wooden penguins, and we will see you